March 15th, 1945, somewhere in the Hurtgen forest, Germany. The inside of an M26 Pershing tank smelled like burnt metal, sweat, and fear. 22-year-old Tommy Rizzo crouched in the loader's position, his gloved hands gripping a 90mm armor-piercing round that weighed nearly 40 pounds. The shell was cold, almost frozen from the German winter that seeped through every seam in the hull. Outside, through 6 inches of steel, he could hear nothing but the diesel engine's roar and the metallic grinding of the tracks churning through mud and snow. Then came the call he'd been dreading. Tiger, 11 o'clock, 800 yards. Sergeant Bill Kowalczyk's voice cracked through the intercom, sharp and urgent. Tommy's heart jumped into his throat. A Tiger. The Germans' heaviest tank, armoured so thick that most Allied shells bounced off like stones against a castle wall. The Pershing was America's answer to the Tiger, newer, faster, with a 90mm gun that could theoretically penetrate German armour at range. Theoretically. The gunner, Corporal Danny Marsh, was already traversing the turret, the hydraulics whining as 50 tons of machinery pivoted to face the threat. Through the narrow vision port, Tommy caught a glimpse of it. A massive grey shape emerging from the tree line, its long 88mm gun pointing straight at them like the finger of death. "Load AP," Kowalczyk shouted. Tommy had done this 1,000 times in training. Crack open the breech, slam the round home, close the breech, yell up, and duck away from the recoil path. He moved on autopilot, his muscles remembering what his mind couldn't process through the adrenaline. The round slid into the chamber with a satisfying metallic click. He yanked the breech lever closed. "Up!" Marsh fired. The gun erupted. The entire tank shook like it had been struck by lightning. The recoil mechanism screamed as the barrel flew backward 8 inches before the hydraulic buffers caught it and shoved it forward again. Smoke filled the turret, acrid and choking. Tommy's ears rang despite the headset cushions. Through the haze, he watched the tracer arc toward the Tiger. And miss. The round sparked off the ground 20 feet to the left of the German tank, throwing up a fountain of frozen earth. "God damn it!" Marsh screamed. "I had him center mass." "Reload! Reload!" Kowalczyk's voice cut through the chaos. Tommy was already moving, his hands reaching for another round from the ready rack. But even as he loaded, even as his body executed the drill, a cold understanding settled in his gut. The Tiger's gun was turning toward them now. They'd get one more shot, maybe 2 before that 88mm sent them to hell. And if Marsh missed again, if the gun threw off his aim again, they wouldn't get a third chance. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The second round went in. Marsh fired. The tank bucked. This time Tommy watched the tracer through a vision slit. It flew true for a heartbeat, then seemed to drift right, clipping the Tiger's track assembly but failing to penetrate. Sparks showered across the German tank's hull, and for a moment Tommy thought they'd immobilized it. But the Tiger kept moving, adjusting, its barrel now locked on their position. "Back! Back! Driver! Reverse!" Kowalczyk was screaming now, his composure cracking. The Pershing lurched backward, tracks spinning, but it was too late. The Tiger fired. The world exploded. Tommy never saw the shell. 1 second he was reaching for another round. The next he was on his back, his helmet ringing like a church bell, blood running from his nose. The Tiger's shot had struck their front glacis plate at an angle a miracle hit that deflected instead of penetrating. If it had been direct, they'd all be dead. "Move! Move!" Kowalczyk was pulling him up, shouting in his face. The driver had them in, full reverse, crashing backward through the forest, branches scraping across the hull like fingernails on a coffin lid. They retreated 200 yards before stopping behind a thick stand of trees, the crew breathing in ragged gasps, the tank's interior thick with smoke and the smell of men who'd just glimpsed death. When the adrenaline finally drained away, leaving only exhaustion and shame, Tommy sat with his back against the ammunition rack and stared at his shaking hands. They'd had the first shot. They'd had the advantage. The Pershing's gun was supposed to be able to kill a tiger, but they'd missed. Twice. And they weren't alone. That night, back at the forward staging area, Tommy sat in the cold March darkness outside the tank, a cigarette burning between his fingers. He wasn't a smoker, the tobacco made him nauseous, but tonight he needed something to do with his hands to keep them from shaking. Around him, other crews huddled by small fires, their faces lit by orange, flame, and marked by the same haunted look he felt in his own bones. The 3rd Armoured Division had been pushing through Germany for weeks, engaging German armour in running battles through forests, villages, and open fields. The new Pershings were supposed to turn the tide, to give American tankers a fighting chance against the tigers and panthers that had dominated the battlefield since Normandy. But the reality was uglier than anyone wanted to admit. They were missing. A lot. Tommy overheard fragments of conversation from the crews nearby. Tank commander voices, usually confident, now edged with frustration and confusion, had him dead to rights at 600 yards. Round went high and left. Same thing happened to Baker Company yesterday. 3 shots, 3 misses. The Germans are getting away because we can't hit them on the first shot. The pattern was undeniable. The Pershing's 90mm gun was powerful enough to penetrate Tiger armour. The ballistics proved it in testing, but in combat, that first critical shot kept missing. And in tank warfare, the first shot was everything. The first tank to land a solid hit usually won. The loser burned. Tommy thought about those 2 missed shots earlier today. Marsh was a good gunner, one of the best in the company. He'd been trained at Fort Knox, scored high marks on every qualification range. This wasn't about skill or nerves. Something else was wrong. "Hey, Rizzo." Tommy looked up. Marsh was approaching, his coveralls still smeared with gun oil and propellant residue. The gunner looked 10 years older than he had this morning, his eyes hollowed out by exhaustion and something deeper doubt. "You felt it, right?" Marsh said quietly, crouching beside him. "When I fired, you felt the whole gun shift." Tommy nodded slowly. He had felt it. During the recoil, in that fraction of a second when the barrel flew backward and the hydraulics fought to stabilize it, the entire turret seemed to twist slightly, like the tank itself was flinching from the blast. "It's not just us," Marsh continued. "I talked to the other gunners. Same thing happening to all of them. The gun's accurate enough on the range, but in combat, something's throwing off the first shot. Could be the terrain, could be the angle, could be the recoil," Tommy said. Marsh stared at him. "What? Think about it. On the range, we're shooting from a stable platform, level ground, no pressure. But here?" Tommy gestured toward the dark forest around them. "We're on slopes. The tank's moving. The enemy's moving. When you fire, the whole system goes haywire for a split second. The barrel jumps back, the turret rocks, and by the time everything settles, the point of aim has shifted. Even a quarter inch at the breech becomes feet at the target." Marsh was quiet for a long moment, his expression shifting from skepticism to something closer to recognition. "The recoil mechanism," he said slowly. "It's designed to absorb the shock, but maybe it's not fast enough. Maybe there's a delay between when I fire and when the system stabilizes. And in that delay," Tommy said, "the round's already gone. It's not going where you aimed. It's going where the gun was pointing during the chaos." It was just a theory, born from 2 terrified soldiers trying to make sense of failure. But it felt true. Tommy had spent the last 6 months loading rounds into that gun, watching it fire hundreds of times. He knew its rhythm, its temperament. The 90mm was a beautiful weapon, precise and powerful, but it was also violent. Every shot was a controlled explosion that sent forces rippling through the entire tank. The recoil mechanism, those hydraulic cylinders and springs designed to absorb 40,000 pounds of force, couldn't work instantly. There was always a delay, a moment of instability, and in tank combat, moments were everything. "So what do we do about it?" Marsh asked. Tommy didn't have an answer. Not yet, but sitting there in the cold German night, staring at his M26 Pershing, this 50-ton marvel of American engineering that still couldn't hit its target when it mattered most. He felt the first stirring of something dangerous, an idea, a question that would have gotten him court-martialed if he'd said it aloud. What if they didn't wait for the recoil to finish? The problem, Tommy would later learn, wasn't new. It had been killing tank crews since 1943. After Normandy, when American Shermans first encountered German Panthers and Tigers in large numbers, the after-action reports painted a grim picture. US tanks were being destroyed at ratios of 4-1, sometimes 5-1. The Germans didn't just have better armour, they had better gunnery. Their first-shot kill rates were devastatingly high. Meanwhile, American crews fired multiple rounds to achieve what the Germans did with one. At the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, Army Ordnance engineers pored over the data, trying to understand why. They tested the Sherman's 75mm gun exhaustively, firing it at captured Panthers from every conceivable angle and range. The ballistics were sound, the optics were adequate. On paper, the Sherman should have been competitive, but paper didn't account for combat conditions. One engineer, a civilian named Dr. Harold Vaught, began studying high-speed film of tank guns firing. What he saw disturbed him. During the moment of discharge, that critical instant when the propellant ignited and 40,000 pounds of force slammed backward through the gun, the entire barrel assembly became unstable. It didn't just recoil smoothly backward as designed. It twisted, flexed, and vibrated. The motion was subtle, measured in fractions of inches, but at combat ranges, those fractions became feet, even yards. Vaught wrote a classified report in early 1944 titled Transient Instability in Tank Gun Systems During Discharge. In it, he described what he called the recoil wobble effect. The problem stemmed from basic physics. The barrel wasn't perfectly rigid, the recoil mechanism couldn't react instantaneously, and the mounting system had microscopic tolerances that allowed movement. When these factors combined during the violence of firing, the gun's point of aim shifted unpredictably. His conclusion was stark. First-round hit probability in combat conditions may be reduced by as much as 30 to 40% compared to static range conditions due to transient instabilities during the recoil cycle. 30 to 40%. That meant if a gunner had an 80% chance of hitting on the range in combat, it dropped to 40 or 50%. Against an enemy who killed on the first shot, those odds were fatal. Vaught's report included a recommendation: redesign the recoil mechanism to provide faster stabilization or develop a fire control system that could compensate for the movement. But by 1944, millions of tanks were already in production. Redesigning was impossible. The report was filed away, its findings noted but not acted upon, until Tommy Rizzo, who'd never heard of Dr. Vaught or his research, started to figure it out for himself. The key wasn't in the engineering manuals or the gunnery doctrine. It was in the split-second timing of the load cycle. Tommy had loaded thousands of rounds by now, and his body had learned something his mind hadn't yet articulated. The gun was most unstable immediately after firing, but it eventually settled into a predictable rhythm. The recoil mechanism wasn't random, it followed the same pattern every time. Slam backward, compress the hydraulics, bounce forward, settle. What if you timed the next round to that rhythm? The regulations were clear. Wait for the gun to fully return to battery position before loading. That meant waiting for the barrel to slide all the way forward, the breech to stabilize, and the entire system to come to rest. Only then was it safe to open the breech and insert the next round. The doctrine existed for good reasons. Loading during recoil could cause mechanical damage, injure the loader, or even cause a catastrophic breech failure. But what if you didn't load during recoil? What if you loaded just before it finished? What if you could time it so perfectly that the round was seated and the breech was closed at the exact instant the gun reached its most stable position? It was a crazy idea, probably dangerous, almost certainly against regulations. Tommy decided to try it anyway. March 18th, 1945, 3 days later. The opportunity came during a training exercise behind the lines. The 3rd Armoured Division had pulled back for resupply and maintenance, giving the exhausted crews a brief respite from combat. For Tommy, it meant access to the practice range without the immediate threat of death, the perfect laboratory for an experiment that could either revolutionize tank warfare or get him dishonorably discharged. The morning was grey and cold, the kind of wet German spring that turned everything to mud. Tommy's tank sat on the firing line alongside 5 others, their guns pointed downrange at a series of target boards set at various distances. The exercise was routine. Each crew would fire 10 rounds at stationary targets to re-zero their sights after the rough treatment of combat operations. It was meant to be simple, methodical, by the book. Tommy had other plans. He'd spent the previous 2 nights lying awake in his bedroll, replaying every shot he'd loaded in combat, feeling the rhythm of the gun in his memory. The recoil cycle took approximately 1.2 seconds from discharge to full return to battery. During that time, the barrel travelled backward 8 inches, compressed the hydraulic buffers, then surged forward, but the motion wasn't uniform. There was a brief moment, Tommy estimated it at about 0.8 seconds into the cycle, when the backward motion stopped and the forward surge began. A pivot point, a moment of transition. What if that moment was actually the most stable point in the entire cycle? Not the end, when doctrine said to load, but the middle. What if the chaos of recoil actually passed through a momentary equilibrium before the barrel slammed forward again? "All right, Rizzo, you ready?" Marsh's voice crackled through the intercom. Tommy gripped a practice round, his heart pounding harder than it had any right to during a simple training drill. "Ready." "Gunner, Sabot, tank, identified." Kowalczyk called out the formal fire command. "Identified," Marsh echoed. "Fire." The gun erupted. The tank shook. Through his loader's periscope, Tommy watched the barrel slam backward, the entire recoil mechanism compressing like a massive spring. This was the moment. Instead of waiting, instead of following procedure, he watched the barrel's motion with absolute focus. 8 inches back, slowing, almost stopped. There. His hands moved before his conscious mind caught up. He cracked the breech hearing. Kowalczyk's surprised intake of breath over the intercom grabbed the next round and slammed it home. The barrel was still moving, just beginning its forward surge, but his timing was perfect. The round seated cleanly, the breech closed, and he yanked his hands clear just as the barrel completed its return to battery position. "Up!" he shouted, his voice sharper than usual. There was a half-second of shocked silence in the turret. "What the hell, Rizzo?" Kowalczyk's voice was tight with anger. "You're supposed to wait for gunner, Sabo, tank," Tommy interrupted, using the formal fire command to cut off the discussion. "Request permission to continue drill." Another pause. Tommy could feel the sergeant's glare through the metal separating them, but they were on a live fire range with a loaded gun. Procedure dictated they complete the firing sequence. "Fire," Kowalczyk said coldly. Marsh fired. The gun erupted again, and this time Tommy really committed to his theory. The instant the barrel began its rearward motion, he started tracking it, his body swaying slightly as if he could feel the hydraulics compressing. At 0.8 seconds, at that pivot point he'd identified, he moved. Breech open, round in, breech closed. Up. The timing was tighter this time, smoother. The barrel completed its return, and Tommy's hands were already clear, already reaching for the next round in a rhythm that felt almost musical. Fire. The pivot point. Load. Up. Fire. They went through all 10 rounds like that, Tommy loading at a pace that should have been impossible, at timings that violated every safety protocol in the manual. By the 8th round, something extraordinary was happening. Marsh stopped being surprised and started anticipating. The gunner could feel the faster rhythm, and his target acquisition sped up to match. They were firing nearly twice as fast as normal, each round cycling through in under 3 seconds instead of the usual 6. When the 10th round left the barrel and the smoke finally cleared, the turret fell silent, except for the ringing in everyone's ears. "Cease fire," Kowalczyk said quietly. "Rizzo, what the fuck was that?" Tommy's hands were shaking, but not from fear this time, from exhilaration. "Sergeant, request permission to check targets." "Denied. Answer my question." "I timed the recoil cycle," Tommy said simply. "Loaded during the transition point instead of after. It's faster." "It's also insane," Kowalczyk shot back. "You could have jammed the breech, could have lost your hands, could have—" "But I didn't," Tommy interrupted. "And Marsh, how did the gun feel? The stability?" There was a long pause. When Marsh finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "Better," he admitted. "I don't know why, but the gun felt steadier, like loading during the recoil somehow dampened the wobble." "That's impossible," Kowalczyk said. "Let's check the targets," Marsh suggested. They drove downrange in a jeep, Kowalczyk at the wheel, his jaw set in a hard line. Tommy sat in back, his mind racing through the implications of what he'd just done. If his theory was right, if loading at that specific moment in the recoil cycle actually improved stability rather than degrading it, then he might have just stumbled onto something that could save lives. If he was wrong, he'd just risked his crew's safety for nothing. The target board stood at 400, 600, and 800 yards, standard engagement ranges for tank combat. Each board was marked with a white circle representing the center mass of an enemy tank's silhouette. As they approached the first set, Tommy's heart sank. The 400-yard target looked like Swiss cheese. All 10 rounds had struck the board, clustered in a tight group just left of center. Good shooting, but not unusual for that range. The 600-yard target told a different story. 8 hits, tight group, dead center. Kowalczyk stopped the jeep and climbed out slowly, walking up to the target board as if approaching something dangerous. He ran his hand over the holes, counting them twice. 8 out of 10, he said quietly. At 600 yards. Marsh, what's your average at this range normally? 5, maybe 6 hits, Marsh admitted, on a good day. They drove to the 800-yard targets in silence. 7 hits. At a range where most gunners were happy to land 3 or 4 rounds on target, they'd achieved 7. The grouping was still tight, clustered around the center of the target silhouette. Kowalczyk stood there for a long time, staring at the punctured metal. When he finally turned back to the jeep, his expression had shifted from anger to something more complicated. Calculation, recognition, maybe even fear. "You've been loading wrong," he said to Tommy. "Or we've been teaching everyone to load wrong. One of the two." "I think it's the timing," Tommy said. "The manual says wait for the gun to settle completely before loading. But when you wait, you're loading the gun at its most unstable moment, right after all that kinetic energy has finished transferring through the system. Everything's still vibrating, still ringing like a bell. But if you load during the recoil cycle, right at the transition point, you're actually taking advantage of the momentum. The weight of the round and the preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Motion of the breech mechanism counterbalance the recoil somehow. It dampens the vibration instead of adding to it. "That's just a theory," Kowalczyk said. "Maybe, but the targets don't lie." Marsh climbed out of the jeep, walked up to the 800-yard target, and put his fingers through one of the holes. "If this works in combat," he said slowly, "if we can hit on the first shot consistently, Tigers won't be the boogeyman anymore." Kowalczyk shook his head. "You know what happens if word gets out about this? If anyone finds out a loader in my crew has been deliberately violating safety protocols." "Court-martial," Tommy said quietly, "for all of us." "Exactly. And even if they don't court-martial us, they'll forbid it. The army doesn't change doctrine because some kid gets a hunch. Kowalczyk looked between his two crewmen, his face torn between duty and pragmatism. But if we don't use this technique, and we get into another engagement with heavy armor, we're probably going to die. The three of them stood in the cold German morning, surrounded by riddled targets that proved something the army had never taught them. Sometimes the rules were wrong. Over the next week, Tommy refined his technique in secret. He practiced during maintenance periods, when the crew test-fired the gun to ensure everything was working properly. He practiced during the limited training time they had between missions. Each time, he got faster, smoother, more confident in his timing. The key was feeling the rhythm, not thinking about it. His body learned to recognize the exact instant when the barrel's rearward motion stopped and the forward surge began that brief moment of equilibrium. He also started studying the recoil mechanism itself, spending hours in the tank with maintenance manuals spread across his lap, tracing the hydraulic lines and spring assemblies that absorbed the massive forces of firing. The more he understood the engineering, the more his theory made sense. The recoil system worked like a shock absorber, but it wasn't instantaneous. When the gun fired, the barrel assembly flew backward, compressing hydraulic fluid through a series of valves and chambers. At the peak of compression, just before the hydraulics shoved the barrel forward again, there was a moment when the pressure was at its maximum and the physical motion was at zero, a still point in the storm. That was when Tommy loaded. By introducing the weight of the round and the mechanical action of the breech at that precise instant, he was actually helping the system stabilize. The added mass dampened vibrations. The breech's closing mechanism provided a counterforce to the hydraulic surge. Instead of fighting the recoil cycle, he was working with it. It was elegant, it was dangerous, and it absolutely violated regulations. Marsh became a believer first. As a gunner, he could feel the difference immediately. The crosshairs stayed steadier on target. The gun didn't jump and settle. It seemed to absorb the recoil more smoothly, coming back to point of aim faster. His confidence grew with each practice session. When Kowalczyk finally authorized him to test the technique in a live fire exercise against a towed target, Marsh achieved a 93% hit rate at 600 yards, nearly unheard of for a tank gun. But Kowalczyk remained conflicted. As tank commander, he was responsible for his crew's lives, but also for maintaining discipline and following doctrine. What Tommy had discovered could save them in combat, but it could also get them all court-martialed if the wrong officer found out. The decision was taken out of his hands on March 24th, when the division received orders to push forward again. Intelligence had identified a German armoured formation including several Tiger IIs, the heaviest tanks in the Wehrmacht, massing near a small town called Paderborn. The third armoured was tasked with engaging and destroying them. They would be in combat within 24 hours. That night, Kowalczyk called his crew together outside the tank. The other vehicles in the company were scattered across the staging area, their crews performing last-minute maintenance and loading ammunition. Fires dotted the landscape, small orange glows against the dark German countryside. Rizzo's technique, Kowalczyk said without preamble. We're using it. Tommy and Marsh exchanged glances. If anyone asks, if anyone sees, if anything goes wrong, Kowalczyk continued, the decision was mine. I ordered it. Rizzo was following commands. Understood? Sergeant, Tommy began. I said understood? Yes, Sergeant. Kowalczyk turned to face his loader directly. You get one mistake tomorrow. One jam, one injury, one malfunction that looks like it came from your timing, and we go back to the manual. Immediately. No arguments. Won't happen, Tommy said. It better not. Because if you're right, if this actually works in combat, you might have just figured out how to keep us all alive. But if you're wrong... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They spent the next hour going through the drill together, Tommy loading dummy rounds while Marsh called out fire commands and Kowalczyk observed with a critical eye. By the 100th repetition, Tommy could load the gun with his eyes closed, his hands finding the precise timing by feel alone. The rhythm had become instinct. When they finally stopped, exhausted and hoarse from calling out commands, Tommy sat on the hull of the Pershing and looked up at the stars. Somewhere out there, German tank crews were doing the same thing, checking their guns, loading their ammunition, preparing for the same battle. The difference was, they'd been trained in their tactics for years. Their doctrine had been proven in combat from North Africa to the Eastern Front. Tommy was about to bet his life and the lives of his crew on a technique he'd invented a week ago. But the targets didn't lie, and tomorrow he'd find out if his impossible trick could actually work when everything was on the line. March 25th, 1945, Paderborn, Germany. The attack began at dawn. The 3rd Armoured Division moved forward in a line, dozens of tanks churning through the muddy German countryside, their engines creating a continuous thunder that rolled across the hills. Tommy rode in darkness inside his M26 Pershing, bouncing with each lurch of the tracks, his hands resting on the first armour-piercing round in the ready rack. His mouth was dry. His heart hammered against his ribs. Every instinct screamed that what he was about to do was insane. Through the intercom, he could hear the terse communications between Kowalczyk and the other tank commanders. Updates on position, formation adjustments, spotting reports. The German armour was out there somewhere, waiting. Intelligence suggested at least a dozen Panthers and 3 or 4 Tiger IIs, the most powerful tanks in the world, armed with 88mm guns that could penetrate a Pershing's armour from over a mile away. All units, this is Cobra 6. The battalion commander's voice crackled through the radio. Enemy armour identified. Grid November 37 Alpha. Panthers moving toward the ridgeline. Engage on contact. Here we go, Marsh muttered. The Pershing crested a small hill, and suddenly the battlefield opened before them. A shallow valley, maybe 800 yards across, with a Sayoba tree line on the far side. And emerging from those trees, like prehistoric monsters rising from the mist, were the German tanks. Tommy caught glimpses through his narrow periscope. Grey shapes, angular and massive, their long guns traversing to track the American advance. 5 Panthers that he could see, maybe more hidden in the smoke and morning fog. And farther back, almost hull down behind a berm, the distinctive silhouette of a Tiger II. 70 tons of German engineering, frontal armour so thick it could shrug off most hits. Gunner, sabot, tank, left front. Kowalczyk's fire command was sharp and clear. Range 800. Marsh was already on it, his hands dancing across the controls as the turret swiveled left. Tommy watched through his periscope as the crosshairs settled on one of the Panthers, a vehicle maybe 50 yards ahead of its companions, exposed as it pushed forward to engage. Identified, Marsh called. Tommy's hands tightened on the 40-pound armour-piercing round. This was it. The first real test. Everything they'd practiced, everything he'd figured out, came down to this moment. If he was wrong, they'd miss, and that Panther would kill them. If he was right, fire! The world exploded. The 90mm gun roared, the tank bucked, and the barrel slammed backward 8 inches in its recoil mechanism. Tommy didn't wait, didn't hesitate, didn't think. His body moved on instinct, tracking the barrel's motion, feeling for that pivot point he'd trained himself to recognize. There. 0.8 seconds. The instant when rearward motion stopped and the forward surge began. His hands flew. Breech open round in breech closed hands clear. Up. The entire sequence took less than a second. Kowalczyk didn't even have time to react before the gun was loaded again. Through his periscope, Tommy saw the result of that first shot. The armour-piercing round had struck the Panther's front glacis plate at a near-perfect angle, penetrating through 60mm of contis steel and detonating inside. The German tank shuddered, smoke erupting from every hatch, and then it simply stopped moving. A kill. A clean first-shot kill at 800 yards. Holy shit, Marsh breathed. I hit him. First shot. Gunner, sabot, tank, 11 o'clock. Kowalczyk was already calling the next target. his voice electric with adrenaline. Another panther moving up. They fell into a rhythm then, a deadly dance of fire and reload that Tommy had never experienced before. The gun would fire, recoil, and at that precise moment, that 0.8-second pivot point, Tommy would load. The breech would close just as the barrel completed its return to battery, and Marsh would already be on target for the next shot. Fire, recoil, load, up, fire. 3 seconds, maybe 4. They were cycling rounds twice as fast as any tank in the division, and more importantly, they were hitting. Each shot seemed to find its mark with uncanny precision. The gun stayed stable, the crosshairs tracked true. Marsh's confidence grew with each kill, his target acquisition faster and more certain. By the time the smoke cleared 5 minutes later, Tommy's tank had destroyed 3 Panthers single-handedly. Around them, the rest of the company was still engaging, their slower rate of fire evident in the continued thunder of guns. Some tanks fired 4 or 5 shots before achieving a kill. Tommy's crew needed one. "Cease fire," Kowalczyk ordered, his voice shaking slightly. "Rizzo, whatever you're doing, keep doing it. Marsh, outstanding shooting." "Sergeant, the gun," Marsh started. "I know, I can feel it. It's steadier. Faster. I don't understand it, but I know it." Kowalczyk's voice took on a harder edge. "Contact left. Big bastard, Tiger 2. Tommy's blood ran cold. The Tiger 2, King Tiger to the Allies, was the tank every American crew dreaded. Its frontal armour was nearly impervious to most Allied guns, even the Pershing's 90mm. Hitting it wasn't enough. You had to hit it in exactly the right place, at exactly the right angle, or the round would simply bounce off. The massive German tank was pushing forward from its hull-down position, its 88mm gun tracking across the battlefield. As Tommy watched through his periscope, it fired, and 800 yards away an American Sherman exploded in a ball of flame. The Tiger 2 didn't even slow down. "Range 1,000 yards, Marsh said, his voice tight. "That's at the edge of our effective range. Can you hit the turret ring?" Kowalczyk asked. The turret ring, the junction between the tank's body and its rotating turret, was one of the few weak points on a Tiger 2, but it was a tiny target, maybe 6 inches tall, and hitting it from 1,000 yards was a matter of luck more than skill. "I can try." "Load AP," Kowalczyk ordered. Tommy already had the round in his hands. The gun was loaded, the breech closed. Marsh had the crosshairs centered on the Tiger 2's glacis plate, but he was adjusting, trying to calculate the precise aim point needed to hit that tiny, vulnerable spot. "Wait," Kowalczyk said suddenly. "Driver, forward 20 yards. Angle us 5 degrees left." Tommy understood immediately Kowalczyk was adjusting their position to give Marsh a better shot angle at the turret ring. It was tactical brilliance, but it also meant they'd be stationary, exposed, when they fired. The Tiger 2's gun began to traverse toward them. "He sees us," Marsh said. "We've got maybe 5 seconds." "Fire when ready," Kowalczyk said calmly. Marsh breathed in, breathed out, let his body settle into the gun's rhythm. Tommy watched through his periscope, fascinated and terrified, as the gunner made minute adjustments to the crosshairs. Up slightly, left, a hair right. The Tiger 2 was nearly 1,000 yards away, a massive target, but they weren't aiming for mass, they were aiming for a 6-inch gap in armour that a human eye could barely see at that distance. "Firing," Marsh said. The gun roared, the barrel slammed backward, and Tommy, moving on pure instinct now, loaded through the recoil at that perfect 0.8-second moment. The round seated cleanly, the breech closed, and his hands were clear before the barrel even completed its return to battery. Up, but his eyes were on the target, watching the tracer arc across the 1,000 yards of space between them and death. The round seemed to take forever to arrive. Tommy saw it curve slightly from the wind, saw it drop as gravity pulled it down, saw it correct as the aerodynamics stabilized. For a heartbeat, he thought they'd missed. The round was going to strike the glacis plate and bounce off, and then that 88mm gun was going to send them all to hell. The armor-piercing round struck the Tiger II's turret ring at a 20-degree angle. The German tank stopped. For a moment, nothing happened. Then smoke began pouring from the turret ring, black and oily. The Tiger II's gun, which had been traversing to target them, froze in place. Through his periscope, Tommy saw crew members bailing out of the hatches, some of them on fire. "Jesus Christ," someone said over the company net. "Did Cobra 3-2 just kill a king tiger?" "Confirmed kill," Kowalczyk responded, his voice carefully neutral despite the adrenaline that had to be screaming through his veins. "Tiger 2, turret ring penetration." The radio erupted in chatter. Disbelief, excitement, demands for confirmation. No one killed king tigers at 1,000 yards. No one killed them on the first shot. It was impossible, but Tommy Rizzo's impossible trick had just done exactly that. The battle for Paderborn lasted 3 more hours, but the outcome was never in doubt after that first engagement. The German armoured formation, already outnumbered, lost its psychological advantage when the supposedly invincible Tiger II burned on the ridgeline. The remaining Panthers withdrew, fighting a running battle through the town's streets before finally retreating east. The 3rd Armoured Division swept forward, clearing the area with surprisingly light casualties. Tommy's tank alone had destroyed 6 enemy vehicles, 3 Panthers, the Tiger II, and 2 armoured personnel carriers that had tried to flank them during the final push. The crew's ammunition racks were nearly empty. Their ears rang from the constant gun blast, and they were exhausted in ways that went beyond physical fatigue. But they were alive. When they finally pulled back to regroup, other tank commanders approached Kowalczyk's Pershing with curiosity and suspicion. Word had spread through the division. Cobra 3-2 was hitting targets that others missed, firing faster than should be possible, achieving kill ratios that seemed too good to be true. Some thought they'd gotten lucky. Others suspected they'd been given special ammunition or a modified gun. The truth was far simpler and far stranger. "Sergeant Kowalczyk," a captain said, approaching the tank with his notebook out, "I need to understand what happened out there. Your crew achieved 12 confirmed hits in 17 shots. That's over 70%. The division average is 35%. What are you doing differently?" Kowalczyk glanced at Tommy, who was sitting on the hull cleaning the breach mechanism. They'd discussed this moment, rehearsed what they'd say, but now that it was here, the weight of it felt immense. If they admitted what they'd done, they might be court-martialed for violating safety protocols. If they lied and kept the technique secret, other crews would keep missing, keep dying. "It's the loader," Kowalczyk said finally. "Rizzo's got a new timing technique. He loads during the recoil cycle instead of after." The captain frowned. "That's against procedure." "Yes, sir. It's dangerous. Could cause a breach failure. Could cost the loader his hands. Could also save the entire crew's life," Kowalczyk said flatly. "Sir." The captain stared at him for a long moment, then turned to Tommy. "Show me." Tommy demonstrated the technique 3 times with dummy rounds, while a growing crowd of tank commanders, gunners, and loaders gathered to watch. He explained the theory, the pivot point in the recoil cycle, the moment of equilibrium, the way loading at that precise instant actually dampened vibration instead of amplifying it. Some of the observers looked skeptical. Others looked intrigued. All of them looked at the burning German tanks on the horizon and did the math. "It's insane," one loader said. "You're loading while the gun's still moving." "I'm loading at the one moment when it's not moving," Tommy corrected, "right between backward and forward motion. That's when it's most stable." "That's not what the manual says." "The manual's wrong." The words hung in the air like blasphemy. Tank doctrine had been written by engineers, tested at Aberdeen, approved by generals. A 19-year-old loader from Brooklyn was claiming it was all incorrect, but the evidence was undeniable. The targets from their training sessions, the combat results from Paderborn, the first shot kills that should have been impossible. Tommy had stumbled onto something that the Army's best minds had missed, that sometimes the right answer wasn't to wait for stability, but to work with instability, to find the still point inside the chaos. The captain made his decision. I'm reporting this up the chain. If it works the way you claim, every tank in the division needs to learn it. But if anyone gets hurt trying this, Sergeant, it's on your head. Understood, sir. Over the next week, word spread through the 3rd Armoured Division like wildfire. Loaders began experimenting with Tommy's timing, at first hesitant, then with growing confidence as they felt what he'd described, that pivot point, that moment of equilibrium. Not everyone could master it. The timing was too precise, too dependent on instinct and feel. But those who did found their crew's hit rates climbing dramatically. By April, Tommy was travelling between companies, demonstrating the technique to new loaders, explaining the theory to skeptical tank commanders. He became a strange sort of celebrity, the kid who'd violated regulations and somehow saved lives because of it. Some officers called him a genius, others called him reckless, most just called him the loader who'd figured out how to kill tigers. The technique never got an official name in Army doctrine. The engineers at Aberdeen, when they finally analysed it months later, confirmed Tommy's theory about the recoil cycle's pivot point, but refused to formally endorse a procedure that violated safety protocols. But in the field, where doctrine met reality, the technique spread anyway. Tank crews called it Rizzo timing, or hot loading, or simply the trick. By the time the war ended in May 1945, estimated first-shot hit rates for American tanks had climbed from 35% to over 60%, not as high as the German rates, but high enough to matter. Analysts later calculated that the technique saved hundreds of American lives in the final months of the European campaign. Tommy Rizzo never received a medal for his discovery. There was no ceremony, no official recognition. The Army didn't award innovations that violated their own regulations, even when those innovations saved lives. But he didn't need recognition. He'd done what mattered. He'd given his fellow tank crews a fighting chance. Epilogue. 60 years later, in 2005, a group of military historians researching World War II tank tactics discovered Tommy Rizzo living in a nursing home in Queens, New York. He was 82 years old, frail but sharp-minded, and he remembered everything about those weeks in Germany when he'd learned to load a gun the wrong way. They asked him how he'd figured it out. Desperation, he said simply. Missing, and men were dying, and the doctrine wasn't working. So I stopped following the doctrine and started watching the gun, really watching it. And once I understood its rhythm, the rest was just timing. They asked if he'd been afraid of getting in trouble. Every day. But I was more afraid of missing, more afraid of watching my buddies burn because I followed rules that didn't work. He paused, his hands still strong despite his age flexing unconsciously, as if gripping an invisible shell. The hardest part wasn't the technique. It was trusting it, trusting that something that felt wrong could be right. The historians published their findings in 2006 Inches, a paper titled Unauthorized Innovation in Combat, the Rizzo Loading Technique and First Shot Kill Rates, 1,945. It detailed how a single tank loader's refusal to accept doctrine had rippled through an entire armoured division, changing tactics and saving lives. Modern tank loaders don't use Rizzo's technique anymore. Automated loading systems and advanced fire control computers have made the issue obsolete. Today's tanks can fire, acquire the next target, and fire again in seconds, with hit rates approaching 90%. The machines do what Tommy did by instinct, but the lesson remains relevant. Sometimes the greatest innovations come not from experts or engineers, but from the people on the ground who refuse to accept that the way we've always done it is the only way, who look at failure and see a pattern, who are willing to break rules when the rules are costing lives. Tommy Rizzo died in 2007, 2 years after the historians found him. At his funeral, 3 of his fellow tank crew members, men in their 80s, survivors of a war fought when they were barely old enough to vote, stood beside his casket and told stories. Not about medals or glory, but about a kid from Brooklyn who'd figured out how to time a recoil cycle and, in doing so, given them all a chance to come home. Sergeant Kowalczyk, who'd made the choice to let Tommy use his illegal technique in combat, summed it up best. "He saved my life," Kowalczyk said quietly. "Not because he was brave, though he was. Not because he was smart, though he was that too. He saved my life because he was willing to be wrong about being right. He trusted something that made no sense, and it turned out to make perfect sense. That's not just courage, that's wisdom." The story of Tommy Rizzo's impossible trick never made it into the official histories of World War II. You won't find it in textbooks or documentaries, but among those who know, among the historians who studied it, the veterans who lived it, and the tankers who still learn about it in informal training sessions, it remains one of the most remarkable examples of combat innovation in military history. A reminder that sometimes the answer to an impossible problem isn't more training or better equipment or stricter doctrine. Sometimes the answer is one person, willing to look at chaos and find the still point inside it. To aim at the moment everyone else ignores. To trust what instinct says can't work, but physics proves does. Tommy Rizzo taught his fellow tankers how to load a gun during recoil and hit their targets on the first shot. But the real lesson he taught was deeper, that the impossible often isn't impossible at all. It's just invisible, waiting for someone brave enough or desperate enough to look at it from a different angle and see what everyone else has missed. In the end, that's what won battles. Not the biggest gun or the thickest armor, but the human mind's ability to adapt, to innovate, to refuse to accept that death is inevitable. Tommy Rizzo looked at a recoil cycle and saw a rhythm. He looked at doctrine and saw dogma. He looked at an impossible problem and found an impossible solution. And in doing so, he gave hundreds of men the one thing that mattered most: a first shot that hit.